history of guerrilla warfare stretches back to ancient history. The history of guerrilla warfare stretches back to ancient history. While guerrilla tactics can be viewed as a natural continuation of prehistoric warfare, the Chinese general and strategist Sun Tzu, in his The Art of War, was the earliest to propose the use of guerrilla warfare. This directly inspired the development of modern guerrilla warfare. Communist leaders like Mao Zedong and North Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh both implemented guerrilla warfare in the style of Sun Tzu, which served as a model for similar strategies elsewhere, such as the Cuban FOCO theory and the anti-Soviet Mujahideen in Afghanistan. While the tactics of modern guerrilla warfare originate in the 20th century, irregular warfare, using elements later characteristic of modern guerrilla warfare, has existed throughout the battles of many ancient civilizations. Ancient general and strategist Sun Tzu, in his The Art of War, was one of the first proponents of the use of guerrilla warfare. The earliest description of guerrilla warfare is an alleged battle between Emperor Huang and the Mayan people in China. Guerrilla warfare was not unique to China. Nomadic and migratory tribes such as the Scythians, Goths, Vandals, and Huns used elements of guerrilla warfare to fight the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and Alexander the Great. Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, widely regarded as the father of guerrilla warfare of his time, devised the Fabian strategy, which was used to great effect against Hannibal's army. Guerrilla warfare was also a common strategy of the various Celtic, Germanic, and African tribes that the Romans faced through their history. Their first great exponent would be the Lusitanian chieftain Viriathus, whose knowledge of guerrilla tactics earned him 8 years of victories over the Roman armies. He would die by treason without being ever decisively bested on the battlefield. The Arverni Gaul Vercingetorix also favored mobile warfare and cutting of supply lines in his revolt against Rome in 52 BC, and Arminius from the Germanic Cherisci capitalized on the terrain and the Roman formations to win the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Another example of an enemy using guerrilla was Tacfarinas, chief of Numidian rebels, who forced Rome into allying with neighboring natives in order to finally defeat him. Later Caratacus, the war chief of the British Catavellauni, employed guerrilla warfare mixed in with occasional set-piece battles for 8 years. Although Caratacus was ultimately captured by the Romans, Tacitus writes that they respected him. In the classic ancient world, this kind of warfare was indirectly mentioned by the Greeks in Homeric stories, but usually as hit-and-run acts of foraging for booty in enemy territory, pretty much as later Vikings piracy. There are not many examples of guerrilla in ancient Greek warfare, though the Aetolians did make use of it against Demosthenes and his heavy hoplite infantry during the Aetolian campaign. Medieval during the Mongol invasion of Europe, guerrilla warfare and stiff resistance helped many Europeans, particularly those at Croatia and Jurzuketia, in preventing the Mongols from setting a permanent hold of their territory and driving them off. In the 15th century, Vietnamese leader Loloy launched a guerrilla war against the Chinese. One of the most successful guerrilla wars was led by George Castrioti Skanderbeg against the invading Ottomans. In 1443, he rallied Albanian forces and drove the Turks from his homeland. Skanderbeg fought a guerrilla war against invading armies up to 20 times larger than his, by using the mountainous terrain to his advantage. He harassed the vast Ottoman army with small, hit-and-run units, as well as using feint retreats followed by sudden counterattacks, and other tactics unknown in warfare up to then. For 25 years Skanderbeg kept the Turks from retaking Albania, which due to its proximity to Italy, could easily have served as a springboard to the rest of Europe. In 1462, the Ottomans were driven back by Wallachian Prince Vlad III Dracula. Vlad was unable to stop the Turks from entering Wallachia, so he resorted to guerrilla war, constantly organizing small attacks and ambushes on the Turks. During the Deluge in Poland, guerrilla tactics were applied. In the 100 Years' War between England and France, Commander Bertrand du Guesclin used guerrilla tactics to pester the English invaders. The Frisian warlord and freedom fighter Pierre Gerlof Stonia fought a guerrilla against Philip I of Castile and with his co-commander Veyard Jelkama against Charles V. During the Dutch Revolt of the 16th century, the Guzen waged a guerrilla war against the Spanish Empire. During the Scanian War, a pro-Danish guerrilla group known as the Snaffane fought against the Swedes. Shivaji Maharaj pioneered Shiva Sutra or Ganimi Kava against the Mughals and other powers in 1645, leading to the establishment of the Maratha state in 1674, sowing seeds of what would become the last great empire in free India. In the 17th century Ireland, Irish irregulars called Tories and Rapparees used guerrilla warfare in the Irish Confederate Wars and the Williamite War in Ireland. Finnish guerrillas, sissies, fought against Russian occupation troops in the Great Northern War, 1710 to 1721. The Russians retaliated brutally against the civilian populace. The period is called Isovia in Finland. Long 18th century North America colonial wars in North America. One of the earliest recorded instances of guerrilla warfare was Appalachian resistance to the Spanish during the Narvaez expedition in 1528 in present-day Florida. In the mid-17th century, the colonists of New France were in conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy. Iroquois forces used hit-and-run tactics, harassment, and avoided costly pitched battles. The colonists of New France began calling these Indian tactics la petite guerre because the tactics were meant for raiding as opposed to pitched battles. Under the tutelage of Wendake, Wabanaki, Algonquin, and Ottawa tutors, the habitants of New France learned la petite guerre and successfully used them against the Iroquois. Led by Major Benjamin Church, New Englanders had also been adopting Indian scouting and raiding tactics since King Philip's War. Throughout the four French and Indian Wars, starting in the late 17th century, Canadians, the Wabanaki Confederacy, and some Acadians brought la petite guerre to New England and the Ohio Valley. In present-day Maine, Father Sebastian Rail led the Wabanaki Confederacy in a petite guerre along the New England-Acadia border. A generation later, in Nova Scotia, Father Jean-Louis Leloutre led the Micmac and the Acadians in a petite guerre behind Anglo-American lines in the lead up to the last French and Indian War. During the French and Indian War, la petite guerre came to the front stage when the Ohio Valley Indians defeated Braddock's expedition near the Forks of Ohio in the Battle of the Monongahela. In Nova Scotia, French officer Charles Deschamps de Boishebert led the Micmac and the Acadians in a guerrilla war, while the British expelled the Acadians from the region. In the Northeast, a New Hampshire backwoodsman, Robert Rogers, began to make a stir in the British military establishment for his success using the tactics of the Little War. British military leaders like Geoffrey Amherst, John Forbes, and Henry Bouquet understood they needed to learn and adopt the techniques and tactics of the Little War or be consumed, like Braddock. The British military establishment began adopting some of the tactics of la petite guerre as light infantry. American Revolution. Although many of the engagements of the American Revolution were conventional, guerrilla warfare was used to a certain extent during this conflict from 1775 to 1783. Which made a significant impact. Guerrilla tactics were first used in the U.S. at the battles of Lexington and Concord by the Patriots at April 19, 1775. George Washington sometimes used some sort of unconventional methods to fight the British. During the Forage War, George Washington sent militia units with limited Continental Army support to launch raids and ambushes on British detachments and forage parties. The militia and Continental Army support would skirmish with British detachments in small-scale battles and engagements. Throughout the Forage War, British casualties exceeded past 900. The Forage War raised morale for the Patriots as their guerrilla operations against the British were very effective. Next, there are other Americans that used hit-and-run raids, ambushes, and surprise attacks against the British, such as William R. Davie, David Wooster, Francis Marion, Shadrach Inman, Daniel Morgan, Morgan's Riflemen, and the Over-Mountain Men. All these American guerrilla fighters did their part by using unconventional tactics to fight the British and Loyalists. Nathaniel Greene used a guerrilla strategy very effectively against Lord Cornwallis. First, Nathaniel Greene would keep retreating to lure the British far from their supply lines, then send out his forces to fight in small skirmishes and engagements with British detachments to weaken them. Then, fighting the conventional battle, Nathaniel Greene fought Lord Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse and gave him a severe blow. Although Lord Cornwallis was the victor, his victory was Pyrrhic as he had too many casualties that he could ill afford. After the British surrender at Yorktown and America gaining their independence, many of these Americans who used guerrilla tactics and strategies became immortalized and romanticized as time passed. Although guerrilla warfare was frequently used when avoiding battles, The Americans fought in conventional linear formations in decisive battles against the British. The American Revolution could be seen as a hybrid war since both conventional and guerrilla warfare was used throughout its duration. Vendée counter-revolution from 1793 to 1796. A revolt broke out against the French Revolution by Catholic royalists in the department of the Vendée. This movement was intended to oppose the persecution endured by the Roman Catholic Church in revolutionary France and ultimately to restore the monarchy. Though ill-equipped and untrained in conventional military tactics, the Vendée counter-revolution, known as the Royal Catholic Army, relied heavily on guerrilla tactics, taking full advantage of their intimate knowledge of the marsh-filled, heavily forested countryside. Though the revolt in the Vendée was eventually pacified by government troops, their successes against the larger, better-equipped Republican army were notable. Works such as La Vendée by Anthony Trollope, G. A. Henty's No Surrender, A Tale of Rising in the Vendée, detail the history of the revolt. Australian Frontier Wars. The Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars, the first of the Australian Frontier Wars, were a series of conflicts between the New South Wales Corps and the Indigenous Australians of the Hawkesbury River and Nepean River in Sydney, Australia. The local Darug people raided farms until Governor Macquarie dispatched troops from the British Army 46th Regiment in 1816. They were fought using mostly guerrilla warfare tactics. However, several conventional battles also took place. Indigenous Australians led by Pemulwuy, a resistance leader, also conducted raids around Parramatta, a western suburb in Sydney, during the period between 1795 and 1802. These attacks led Governor Philip Gidley King to issue an order in 1801 which authorized settlers to shoot Indigenous Australians on sight in Parramatta, Georges River and Prospect areas. The wars resulted in the defeat of the Hawkesbury River and Nepean River Indigenous clans who were subsequently dispossessed of their lands. Napoleonic Wars. Wherever we arrived, they disappeared. Whenever we left, they arrived. They were everywhere and nowhere. They had no tangible center which could be attacked. Prussian officer during the Peninsular War. While fighting with French regulars against Spanish guerrillas in the Napoleonic Wars, many of the armies lived off the land. This often led to some resistance by the local population if the army did not pay fair prices for products they consumed. Usually, this resistance was sporadic and not very successful, so it is not classified as guerrilla action. There are three notable exceptions, though: the Rebellion of 1809 in Tyrol led by Andreas Hofer, Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In Napoleon's invasion of Russia of 1812, two actions could be seen as initiating guerrilla tactics. The burning of Moscow after it had been occupied by Napoleon's Grand Army, depriving the French of shelter in the city, resembled guerrilla action insofar as it was an attack on the available resources rather than directly on the troops. In a different sense, the imperial command that the Russian serfs should attack the French resembled guerrilla tactics in its reliance on partisans rather than army regulars. This did not so much spark a guerrilla war as encourage a revengeful slaughter of French deserters by Russian peasants. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Kutuzov permitted then Hussar Lieutenant Colonel Denis Davidov to open the partisan war against the French communications. Davidov, Seslavin, Figner and others are since known in Russia as the Partisan Rangers of the year 12. They were successful in their operations, making the French troops unable to fight or even move, because of food and ammunition shortage, and not just because of the Russian winter as is usually stated. Peninsular War. In the Peninsular War, Spanish and Portuguese guerrillas tied down tens of thousands of French troops and killed hundreds of thousands. The continual losses of troops caused Napoleon to describe this conflict as his Spanish ulcer. This was one of the most successful partisan wars in history and was where the word guerrilla was first used in this context. The Oxford English Dictionary lists Wellington as the oldest known source, speaking of guerrillas, in 1809. Poet William Wordsworth showed a surprising early insight into guerrilla methods in his pamphlet on the Convention of Sintra. It is manifest that, though a great army may easily defeat or disperse another army, less or greater, yet it is not in a like degree formidable to a determined people, nor efficient in a like degree to subdue them, or to keep them in subjugation, much less if this people, like those of Spain in the present instance, be numerous and, like them, inhabit a territory extensive and strong by nature. For a great army, and even several great armies, cannot accomplish this by marching about the country, unbroken, but each must split itself into many portions, and the several detachments become weak accordingly, not merely as they are small in size, but because the soldiery, acting thus, necessarily relinquish much of that part of their superiority, which lies in what may be called the engineer of war, and far more, because they lose, in proportion as they are broken, the power of profiting by the military skill of the commanders, or by their own military habits. The experienced soldier is thus brought down nearer to the plain ground of the inexperienced, man to the level of man. And it is then that the truly brave man rises, the man of good hopes and purposes, and superiority in moral brings with it superiority in physical power. This war saw British and Portuguese forces using Portugal as a secure position to launch campaigns against the French army, while Spanish guerrilleros bled the occupiers. Gates notes that much of the French army was rendered unavailable for operations against Wellington because innumerable Spanish contingents kept materializing all over the country. In 1810, for example, when Massena invaded Portugal, the imperial forces in the peninsula totaled a massive 325,000 men, but only about 1/4 of these could be spared for the offensive. The rest were required to contain the Spanish insurgents and regulars. This was the greatest single contribution that the Spaniards were to make, and, without it, Wellington could not have maintained himself on the continent for long, let alone emerge victorious from the conflict. Combined, the regular and irregular Allied forces prevented Napoleon's marshals from subduing the rebellious Spanish provinces. War of 1812. Although a great number of engagements were conventional, unconventional warfare was used to a certain extent by the Americans in their second conflict with the British Empire. This war has been a controversial between historians and scholars. However, it cannot be denied that some guerrilla actions did take place and were expertly used by the Americans. The Americans used forms of unconventional warfare, such as raiding, hit-and-run incursions, surprise attacks, and sometimes ambushes. The three commanders of the regiment of riflemen were fairly competent in some limited unconventional types of warfare against the British Empire, such as Benjamin Forsyth, Daniel Appling, and Ludowick Morgan. Other Americans that used hit-and-run raids plus surprise incursions were Duncan MacArthur, Alexander Smith, Andrew Holmes, Daniel Bissell, John B. Campbell, and George McGlasson. The United States, however, also had amphibious-like combatants that could be seen as guerrillas of the sea. These were either American naval commanders or privateers that raided British merchant shipping. The privateers were able to raid the British ships by raising British colors to surprise and capture British ships, or disguise one ship as a harmless-looking vessel with hidden riflemen to ambush, surprise unsuspecting British ships. These Americans were Mellingthon Taylor Woolsey, Otway Burns, Thomas Boyle, David Porter, Jesse Elliott, John Percival, John O.R. Drono, and William Josephus Stafford. Next, the American militia, which were famous for their forms of guerrilla warfare in the American Revolution, were not used so effectively in the War of 1812. It has been reported that the militia were poorly utilized as conventional troops, poorly armed, underfunded, and poorly trained, which made them significantly less effective than their American Revolutionary counterparts. Because of these conditions, the American militia was given a poor status, therefore they could only do so little damage. However, if used carefully in a sophisticated way, they could have been effective guerrilla fighters. One of the most notable commanders to use the guerrilla tactics effectively was Alexander Macomb. His exploits are mentioned in the book, The Battles at Plattsburgh, September 11, 1814, by Keith A. Percallo. This history book mentions how General Alexander Macomb had the American militia fire at the British from behind trees, rocks, and bushes while retreating or maneuvering around them in the woods during the Battle of Plattsburgh. British and Canadian commanders quoted how the American militia were formidable and did not fight like gentlemen by firing from concealed positions behind trees and rocks. It was said that the American militia, with their guerrilla-style fighting in this battle, played an important role in America's victory of Plattsburgh. At the end of the war, America gained very little favorable results, such as the defeat of their formidable Native America foe Tecumseh's Confederacy. America could only fight the British to a draw at the end of this conflict. It's debatable if any of these American combatants' guerrilla-like actions had any impact on the outcome of the war, but they do provide good insight of lessons to be learned for future military commanders and historians yearning to learn the ways of guerrilla tactics and strategy. 19th century American Civil War. Irregular warfare in the American Civil War followed the patterns of irregular warfare in 19th century Europe. Structurally, irregular warfare can be divided into three different types conducted during the Civil War: People's War, partisan warfare, and raiding warfare. The concept of People's War, first described by Karl von Clausewitz in On War, was the closest example of a mass guerrilla movement in the era. In general, this type of irregular warfare was conducted in the hinterland of the border states, and was marked by a vicious neighbor against neighbor conflict. One such example was the opposing irregular forces operating in Missouri and northern Arkansas from 1862 to 1865, most of which were pro-Confederate or pro-Union in name only and preyed on civilians and isolated military forces of both sides with little regard of politics. From these semi-organized guerrillas, several groups formed and were given some measure of legitimacy by their governments. Quantrill's Raiders, who terrorized pro-Union civilians and fought federal troops in large areas of Missouri and Kansas, was one such unit. Another notorious unit, with debatable ties to the Confederate military, was led by Champ Ferguson along the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Ferguson became one of the only figures of Confederate cause to be executed after the war. Dozens of other small, localized bands terrorized the countryside throughout the border region during the war, bringing total war to the area that lasted until the end of the Civil War and, in some areas, beyond. Partisan warfare, in contrast, more closely resembles commando operations of the 20th century. Partisans were small units of conventional forces, controlled and organized by a military force for operations behind enemy lines. The 1862 Partisan Ranger Act passed by the Confederate Congress authorized the formation of these units and gave them legitimacy, which placed them in a different category than the common bushwhacker or guerrilla. John Singleton Mosby formed a partisan unit which was very effective in tying down federal forces behind Union lines in Northern Virginia in the last 2 years of the war. Lastly, deep raids by conventional cavalry forces were often considered irregular in nature. The partisan brigades of Nathan Bedford Forrest and John Hunt Morgan operated as part of the cavalry forces of the Confederate Army of Tennessee in 1862 and 1863. They were given specific missions to destroy logistical hubs, railroad bridges, and other strategic targets to support the greater mission of the Army of Tennessee. By mid-1863, with the destruction of Morgan's raiders during the Great Raid of 1863, the Confederacy conducted few deep cavalry raids in the latter years of the war, mostly because of the losses in experienced horsemen and the offensive operations of the Union Army. Federal cavalry conducted several successful raids during the war, but in general used their cavalry forces in a more conventional role. A good exception was the 1863 Grierson's raid, which did much to set the stage for General Ulysses S. Grant's victory during the Vicksburg campaign. Federal counter-guerrilla operations were very successful in preventing the success of Confederate guerrilla warfare. In Arkansas, federal forces used a wide variety of strategies to defeat irregulars. These included the use of Arkansas Unionist forces as anti-guerrilla troops, the use of riverine forces such as gunboats to control the waterways, and the provost marshal military law enforcement system to spy on suspected guerrillas and to imprison those captured. Against Confederate raiders, the Federal Army developed an effective cavalry themselves and reinforced that system by numerous blockhouses and fortification to defend strategic targets. However, Federal attempts to defeat Mosby's partisan Rangers fell short of success because of Mosby's use of very small units operating in areas considered friendly to the rebel cause. Another regiment known as the Thomas Legion, consisting of white and anti-Union Cherokee Indians, morphed into a guerrilla force and continued fighting in the remote mountain backcountry of western North Carolina for a month after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. That unit was never completely suppressed by Union forces, but voluntarily ceased hostilities after capturing the town of Waynesville on May 10, 1865. In the late 20th century, several historians have focused on the non-use of guerrilla warfare to prolong the war. Near the end of the war, there were those in the Confederate government, notably Jefferson Davis, who advocated continuing the Southern fight as a guerrilla conflict. He was opposed by generals such as Robert E. Lee, who ultimately believed that surrender and reconciliation were better than guerrilla warfare. See also bushwhackers and jayhawkers. South African war guerrilla tactics were used extensively by the forces of the Boer republics in the First and Second Boer Wars in South Africa against the invading British Army. In the First Boer War, the Boer commandos wore their everyday dull-colored farming clothes. The Boers relied more on stealth and speed than discipline and formation, and, being expert marksmen using smokeless ammunition, the Boer were able to easily snipe at British troops from a distance. So the British Army relaxed their close formation tactics. The British Army had changed to khaki uniforms, first used by the British Indian Army, a decade earlier, and officers were soon ordered to dispense with gleaming buttons and buckles which made them conspicuous to snipers. In the third phase of the Second Boer War, after the British defeated the Boer armies in conventional warfare and occupied their capitals of Pretoria and Bloemfontein, Boer commandos reverted to mobile warfare. Units led by leaders such as Jan Smuts and Christian de Wet harassed slow-moving British columns and attacked railway lines and encampments. The Boers were almost all mounted and possessed long-range magazine-loaded rifles. This gave them the ability to attack quickly and cause many casualties before retreating rapidly when British reinforcements arrived. In the early period of the guerrilla war, Boer commandos could be very large, containing several thousand men and even field artillery. However, as their supplies of food and ammunition gave out, the Boers increasingly broke up into smaller units and relied on captured British arms, ammunition, and uniforms. To counter these tactics, the British under Kitchener interned Boer civilians into concentration camps and built hundreds of blockhouses all over the Transvaal and Orange Free State. Kitchener also enacted a scorched earth policy, destroying Boer homes and farms. Eventually, the Boer guerrillas surrendered in 1902, but the British granted them generous terms in order to bring the war to an end. This showed how effective guerrilla tactics could be in extracting concessions from a militarily more powerful enemy. Philippine-American War. At the start of the Philippine-American War, even with the recommendation of the able General Antonio Luna, guerrilla warfare strategy was viewed by the Philippine side only as a tactical option of final recourse. This led to subsequent defeat of the Filipino forces in the early stages of the war, mainly due to superior American weaponry and troops. Guerrilla warfare was only used as a main strategy on November 13, 1899, which made American occupation of the Philippine archipelago all the more difficult over the next few years. This can be greatly seen by the Moro insurrection at the southern province of the Philippines, wherein Moro rebels will conceal themselves in the thick Philippine jungle and will charge American troops with only bolo knives in overwhelming numbers at the opportune time. These led the American weapons manufacturers to develop the famed M1911 pistol. War of the Pacific. During the War of the Pacific, the Peruvian General Andrés Avelino Caceres fought a 3-year guerrilla war against the victorious Chilean army in the Andean region of Peru from 1881 to 1883. This campaign was later studied in the Austrian Theresian Military Academy as an excellent illustration of successful mountain warfare. Mexican Revolution. In the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920, the populist revolutionary leader Emiliano Zapata employed the use of predominantly guerrilla tactics. His forces, composed entirely of peasant farmers turned soldiers, wore no uniform and would easily blend into the general population after an operation's completion. They would have young soldiers, called dynamite boys, hurl cans filled with explosives into enemy barracks, and then a large number of lightly armed soldiers would emerge from the surrounding area to attack it. Although Zapata's forces met considerable success, his strategy backfired as government troops, unable to distinguish his soldiers from the civilian population, waged a broad and brutal campaign against the latter. Brigandage. In South Italy. After the Italian unification in 1860, many bands composed mainly by peasants emerged in southern Italy. The sources of the trouble were the carelessness of the new government toward the problems of the southern laborers, higher taxes and higher prices of basic necessities, mandatory military service who subtracted youths from the workforce, and the economical benefits reserved only for the bourgeois society. In this period, thousands of Poors took the way of brigandage. The most well-known brigand was Carmen Crocco, a former soldier in the service of Giuseppe Garibaldi, who formed an army of 2,000 men. Crocco was renowned for his guerrilla tactics, which were enhanced by the same royal soldiers who chased him. His warfare included cutting water supplies, destroying flour mills, cutting telegraph wires, and ambushing stragglers. Others. In 1848, Both the nation and the United Irishmen advocated guerrilla warfare to overthrow English rule in Ireland, though no actual warfare took place. The Poles and Lithuanians used guerrilla warfare during the January uprising of 1863 to 1865 against the Russian Empire. In the 19th century, peoples of the Balkans used guerrilla tactics to fight the Ottoman Empire. The North African Muslims' uprisings against the colonial powers after Second World War. Guerrilla warfare tactics were first applied in India by Sher Shah Suri or even before the coup war Zam Shah against the Mongol. During the early stages of the Franco-Prussian War, the Franks-Tireurs conducted guerrilla warfare against the occupying Prussian army. World Wars, Irish War of Independence and Civil War. The wars between Ireland and the British state have been long, and over the centuries have covered the full spectrum of the types of warfare. The Irish fought the first successful 20th century War of Independence against the British Empire and the United Kingdom. After the military failure of the Easter Rising in 1916, the Irish Republican Army used guerrilla tactics involving both urban guerrilla warfare and flying columns in the countryside during the Irish War of Independence of 1919 to 1922. Many were inspired by the fabled exploits of the 1799 to 1803 guerrilla campaign by Michael Dwyer after the failed 1798 rebellion. The chief IRA commanders in the localities during this period were Tom Barry, Sayumas Robinson, Liam Lynch, Sean McOwen, and Tom Maguire. The IRA guerrilla was of considerable intensity in parts of the country, notably in Dublin and in areas such as County Cork, County Kerry and County Mayo in the south and west. Despite this, the Irish fighters were never in a position to either hold territory or take on British forces in a conventional manner. Even the largest engagements of the conflict, such as the Kilmichael ambush or Crossbarry ambush, constituted mere skirmishes by the standards of a conventional war. Another aspect of the war, particularly in the northeastern part of the province of Ulster, was communal violence. The Unionist majority there, who were largely Protestant and loyal to Britain, were granted control over the security forces there, in particular the Ulster Special Constabulary, and used them to attack the nationalist population in reprisal for IRA actions. Elsewhere in Ireland, where Unionists were in a minority, they were sometimes attacked by the IRA for aiding the British forces. The extent to which the conflict was an intercommunal one as well as war of national liberation is still strongly debated in Ireland. The total death toll in the war came to a little over 2,000 people. By mid-1921, the military and political costs of maintaining the British security forces in Ireland eventually proved too heavy for the British government. In July 1921, the UK government agreed to a truce with the IRA and agreed to meet representatives of the Irish First Dáil, who since the 1918 general election held 73 of the 105 parliamentary seats for the island. Negotiations led to a settlement, the Anglo-Irish Treaty. It created the Irish Free State of 26 counties as a dominion within the British Empire. The other 6 counties remained part of the UK as Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army split into pro- and anti-treaty factions, with the anti-treaty IRA forces losing the Irish Civil War which followed. The partition of Ireland laid the seeds for the later Troubles. The Irish Civil War is a striking example of the failure of guerrilla tactics when used against a relatively popular native regime. Following their failure to hold fixed positions against an Irish Free State offensive in the summer of 1922, the IRA reformed flying columns and attempted to use the same tactics they had successfully used against the British. However, against Irish troops, who knew them and the terrain and faced with the hostility of the Roman Catholic Church and the majority of Irish nationalist opinion, they were unable to sustain their campaign. In addition, the Free State government, confident of its legitimacy among the Irish population, sometimes used more ruthless and effective measures of repression than the British had felt able to employ. Whereas the British executed 14 IRA men in 1919 to 1922, the Free State executed 77 anti-treaty prisoners officially, and its troops killed another 150 prisoners or so in the field. The Free State also interned 12,000 Republicans, compared with the British figure of 4,500. The last anti-treaty guerrillas abandoned their military campaign against the Free State after 9 months in March 1923. World War I. In a successful campaign in German East Africa, the German commander Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck fought against the numerically superior Allied forces. Even though he was cut off from Germany and had few Germans under his command, he won multiple victories during the East Africa campaign and managed to exhaust and trouble the Allies. He was undefeated up until his acceptance of a ceasefire in northern Rhodesia 3 days after the end of the war in Europe. He returned to Germany as a hero. Major guerrilla war was fought by the Arabs against the Ottoman Turks during the Arab Revolt. Attacking the Hejaz Railway to disrupt Ottoman forces is a strategy often credited to the British officer T.E. Lawrence. Another guerrilla war opposed the German occupation of Ukraine in 1918, and partisan and guerrilla forces fought against both the Bolsheviks and the Whites during the Russian Civil War. This fighting continued into 1921 in Ukraine, in Tambov province, and in parts of Siberia. Other guerrillas opposed the Japanese occupation of the Russian Far East. Second Sino-Japanese War. Despite a common misconception, both nationalist and communist forces maintained active underground resistance in Japanese-occupied areas during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Even before the outbreak of total war in 1937, partisans were already present in Manchuria, hampering Japan's occupation of the region. After the initial phases of the war, when large swaths of the North China Plain rapidly fell to the Japanese, underground resistance, supported by either communist sympathizers or composed of disguised nationalist soldiers, would soon rise up to combat the garrison forces. They were quite successful, able to sabotage railroad routes and ambush reinforcements. Many major campaigns, such as the 4 failed invasions of Changsha, were caused by overly stretched supply lines, lack of reinforcements, and ambushes by irregulars. The communist cells, many having decades of prior experience in guerrilla warfare against the nationalists, usually fared much better, and many nationalist underground groups were subsequently absorbed into communist ones. Usually, in Japanese-occupied areas, the IJA only controlled the cities and railroad routes, with most of them countryside either left alone or with active guerrilla presence. The People's Republic of China has emphasized their contribution to the Chinese war effort, going as far to say that in addition to an overt theater, which in many cases they deny was effective, there was also a covert theater, which they claim did much to stop the Japanese advance. World War II. Many clandestine organizations operated in the countries occupied by German Reich during the Second World War. These organizations began forming as early as 1939 when, after the defeat of Poland, the members of what would become the Polish Home Army began to gather. In March 1940, a partisan unit of the 1st Guerrilla Commanders in the Second World War in Europe under Major Henryk Dobrzański-Kubel completely destroyed a battalion of German infantry in a skirmish near the village of Husiska. A guerrilla movement in Ethiopia was formed to rout out Italian forces as early as 1935. Other clandestine organizations operated in Denmark, Belgium, Norway, France, Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, Italy, Albania, and Greece. From the second half of 1944, the total forces of the Yugoslav partisans numbered over 500,000 men organized in 4 field armies, which engaged in conventional warfare. By 1944, the Polish resistance was thought to number 600,000. Many of these organizations received help from the British-operated Special Operations Executive, which along with the Commandos was initiated by Winston Churchill to set Europe ablaze. The SOE was originally designated as Section D of MI6, but its aid to resistance movements to start fires clashed with MI6's primary role as an intelligence gathering agency. When Britain was under threat of invasion, SOE trained auxiliary units to conduct guerrilla warfare in the event of invasion. Even the Home Guard were trained in guerrilla warfare in the case of invasion of England. Osterley Park was the first of 3 such schools established to train the Home Guard. Not only did SOE help the resistance to tie down many German units as garrison troops, so directly aiding the conventional war effort, but also guerrilla incidents in occupied countries were useful in the propaganda war, helping to repudiate German claims that the occupied countries were pacified and broadly on the side of the Germans. Despite these minor successes, many historians believe that the efficacy of the European resistance movements has been greatly exaggerated in popular novels, films, and other media. Contrary to popular belief, in the Western and Southern Europe, the resistance groups were only able to seriously counter the German in areas that offered the protection of rugged terrain. In relatively flat, open areas, such as France, the resistance groups were all too vulnerable to decimation by German regulars and pro-German collaborators. Only when operating in concert with conventional Allied units were the resistance groups to prove indispensable. All the clandestine resistance movements and organizations in the occupied Europe were dwarfed by the partisan warfare that took place on the vast scale of the Eastern Front combat between Soviet partisans and the German Reich forces. The strength of the partisan units and formations cannot be accurately estimated, but in Belarusia alone is thought to have been in excess of 300,000. This was a planned and closely coordinated effort by the STAVKA, which included insertion of officers and delivery of equipment, as well as coordination of operational planning with the regular Red Army forces such as Operation Concert in 1943 and the massive sabotage of German logistics in preparation for commencement of Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. Guerrilla tactics were employed in the war in the Pacific as well. When Japanese forces invaded the island of Timor on the 20th of February 1942, they were resisted by a small, under-equipped force of Allied military personnel, known as Sparrow Force, predominantly from Australia, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands East Indies. Although Portugal was not a combatant, many East Timorese civilians and some Portuguese colonists fought with the Allies as guerrillas, or provided food, shelter, and other assistance. Some Timorese continued a resistance campaign following the Australian withdrawal. Squad of Kachin Rangers employed by the U.S. Army as guerrilla fighters in Burma when the United States entered the war. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services cooperated and enhanced the work of SOE as well as working on its own initiatives in the Far East. Colonel Wendell Fertig in 1942 organized a large guerrilla force which harassed the Japanese occupation forces on the Philippine island of Mindanao all the way up to the liberation of the Philippines in 1945. After the surrender of Bataan and Corregidor, which was the last organized resistance against the Imperial Japanese Army, Filipino guerrillas fought the Japanese throughout the war and became a very important force during the liberation of the Philippines. The exploits of these American commanders and Filipino guerrillas influenced the later formation of the United States Green Berets. Others included Col. Aaron Bank, Col. Russell Volkman, and Col. William R. Pierce. Volkman commanded a guerrilla force which operated out of the Cordillera of northern Luzon in the Philippines from the beginning of World War II to its conclusion. He remained in radio contact with U.S. forces prior to the invasion of Lingayen Gulf. Pierce, who later became a general, commanded OSS Detachment 101 in Burma. Because it was never larger than a few hundred Americans, it relied on support from various Burmese tribal groups. In particular, the vigorously anti-Japanese Kachin people were vital to the unit's success. The Chindits, officially in 1943 77th Indian Infantry Brigade and in 1944 3rd Indian Infantry Division, were a British India special force that served in Burma and India in 1943 and 1944 during the Burma campaign. They were formed to put into effect Ord Wingate's newly developed guerrilla warfare tactic of long-range penetration. The Japanese military themselves also used guerrilla warfare during the later part of the Pacific War, when Japan's resource was already dwindling and the Allies have started invading. Tadamichi Kuribayashi famously used guerrilla warfare during the Battle of Iwo Jima, where the general used network of tunnels and caves to attack American forces. His tactic was somewhat successful, delaying the Americans from taking Iwo Jima for 36 days. The same tactic was used during the Battle of Okinawa. Cold War-era Baltic anti-Soviet campaigns after World War II. During the 1940s and 1950s, thousands of fighters in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania participated in unsuccessful guerrilla warfare against Soviet occupation. In Lithuania, guerrilla warfare was massive until 1958, and the last fighter in Estonia was discovered and killed in 1978. Israel-European Jews fleeing from anti-Semitic violence immigrated in increasing numbers to Palestine. When the British restricted Jewish immigration to the region, Jewish immigrants began to use guerrilla warfare against the British for two purposes: to bring in more Jewish refugees and to turn the tide of British sentiment at home. Jewish groups such as the Lehigh and the Irgun, many of whom had experience in the Warsaw Ghetto battles against the Nazis, fought British soldiers whenever they could, including the bombing of the King David Hotel. They also conducted attacks against the Arabs and prepared the infrastructure for the coming 1948 conflict. The Jewish irregular forces were fighting the British Empire, which had just emerged victorious from World War II. Some of these groups were amalgamated into the Israel Defense Forces and subsequently fought in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Second Indochina War within South Vietnam within the United States. The Vietnam War is commonly thought of as a guerrilla war. However, this is a simplification of a much more complex situation which followed the pattern outlined by Maoist theory. The National Liberation Front, drawing its ranks from the South Vietnamese peasantry and working class, used guerrilla tactics in the early phases of the war. However, by 1965, when U.S. involvement escalated, the National Liberation Front was in the process of being supplanted by regular units of the North Vietnamese Army. The NVA regiments organized along traditional military lines were supplied via the Ho Chi Minh Trail rather than living off the land, and had access to weapons such as tanks and artillery which are not normally used by guerrilla forces. Furthermore, parts of North Vietnam were off-limits by American bombardment for political reasons, giving the NVA personnel and their material a haven that does not usually exist for a guerrilla army. Over time, more of the fighting was conducted by the North Vietnamese Army and the character of the war became increasingly conventional. The final offensive into South Vietnam in 1975 was a mostly conventional military operation in which guerrilla warfare played a minor, supporting role. The Cu Cai Tunnels was a major base for guerrilla warfare during the Vietnam War. Located about 60 kilometers northwest of Saigon, the Viet Cong used the complex system tunnels to hide and live during the day and come up to fight at night. Throughout the Vietnam War, the Communist Party closely supervised all levels of the conflict. The bulk of the VC-NLF were initially Southerners, with some distinctive Southern issues and sensibilities. Nevertheless, the VC-NLF was associated with the Northern Lao Dong Party, which furnished it with supplies, weaponry and trained cadres, including regular NVA, PAVN troops. The Southern Communist Party, the People's Revolutionary Party, organized in 1962 to participate in the insurgency, and COVSN, Central Office for Southern Vietnam, which partially controlled military activity. The general replacement of CV irregulars with NVA troops supplanted the original VC goals with those proposed by the NVA. As the 1968 Tet Offensive was primarily a VC operation in which large numbers of VC fighters were killed, increasing the role of the NVA in the war effort. This is a set of tactics which were used frequently in the Vietnam War by the NVA. Within Laos, the Central Intelligence Agency raised a guerrilla army to oppose PAVN invaders of the Kingdom of Laos. Consisting principally Hmong Hill tribesmen, L'Armée Clandestine under General Vang Pao was the only guerrilla army to ever enjoy air supremacy. It fought the Vietnamese regulars from 1961 to 1975 before reduced numbers and dwindling American support led to their defeat. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan started with a rapid takeover of the major cities but then turned into a decade-long guerrilla resistance. The Afghan side was a collection of tribes who initially fought with obsolete weapons such as rifles from the 19th century or the First World War. The resistance fighters were known collectively as the Mujahideen. The United States and United Kingdom started to support the Afghanistan resistance with gradually more potent weapons and eventually anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, which then would cause so much damage to the far larger Soviet army that the Soviet Union abandoned its occupation and retreated back to the Soviet Union. Bangladesh Liberation War Mukti Bahini collectively refers to the armed organizations who fought against the Pakistan Army during the Bangladesh Liberation War. It was dynamically formed by Bengali regulars and civilians after the proclamation of independence for Bangladesh on March 26, 1971. Subsequently, by mid-April 1971, the former members of East Pakistan Armed Forces formed the Bangladesh Armed Forces, and MAG Osmani assumed the command of the same. The civilian groups continued to assist the armed forces during the war. After the war, Mukti Bahini became the general term to refer to all forces of former East Pakistani origin fighting against the Pakistani armed forces during the Bangladesh Liberation War. Often Mukti Bahini operated as an effective guerrilla force to keep their enemies on the run. It has been compared to the French Maquis, the Viet Cong, and the guerrillas of Josip Broz Tito in their tactics and effectiveness. Northern Ireland conflict. In the late 1960s, the Troubles began again in Northern Ireland. They had their origins in the partition of Ireland during the Irish War of Independence. They came to an end with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. The violence was characterized by an armed campaign against the British presence in Northern Ireland by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, British counter-insurgency policy, and attacks on civilians by both Loyalists and Republicans. There were also allegations of collusion between Loyalist paramilitaries and British security forces, and to a lesser extent, Republicans in both British and Irish security forces. Although both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries carried out terrorist atrocities against civilians which were often tit for tat, a case can be made for saying that attacks such as the Provisional IRA carried out on British soldiers at Warrenpoint in 1979 was a well-planned guerrilla ambush. Anti-Good Friday Agreement splinter groups could be called guerrillas but are usually called terrorists or dissidents by governments of both the British and Irish governments. The news media such as the BBC and CNN will often use the term gunman, as in IRA gunman or Loyalist gunman. Since 1995, CNN also uses guerrilla as in IRA guerrilla and Protestant guerrilla. Reuters, in accordance with its principle of not using the word terrorist except in direct quotes, refers to guerrilla groups. Latin American insurgents in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Latin America had several urban guerrilla movements whose strategy was to destabilize regimes and provoke a counter-reaction by the military. The theory was that a harsh military regime would oppress the middle classes who would then support the guerrillas and create a popular uprising. While these movements did destabilize governments, such as Argentina, Uruguay, Guatemala, and Peru to the point of military intervention, the military generally proceeded to completely wipe out the guerrilla movements, usually committing several atrocities among both civilians and armed insurgents in the process. Several other left-wing guerrilla movements, sometimes backed by Cuba, attempted to overthrow US-backed governments or right-wing military dictatorship. US-backed Contra-guerrillas attempted to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista government of Nicaragua. The Sandinista revolution saw the involvement of women in the armed struggle in Nicaragua. Algeria-Iran-Iraq War. During the 8-year Iran-Iraq War, irregular warfare was used against Iraqi military. The Iranian Irregular Warfare Headquarters, the 65th Airborne Special Forces Brigade of Iranian Army, and Peshmerga of Iraqi Kurdistan were involved. Since 1990, since 2000, the Greek Marxist the 17th of November disbanded around 2002 following the capture and imprisonment of much of its leadership. The ongoing war between pro-independence groups in Chechnya and the Russian government is currently the most active guerrilla war in Europe. Most of the incidents reported by the Western news media are very gory terrorist acts against Russian civilians committed by Chechen separatists outside Chechnya. However, within Chechnya, the war has many of the characteristics of a classic guerrilla war. See the article History of Chechnya for more details. In Northern Ireland, the real Irish Republican Army and the Continuity Irish Republican Army, two small, radical splinter groups who broke with the Provisional Irish Republican Army, continue to exist. They are dwarfed in size by the Provisional IRA and have been less successful in terms of both popularity among Irish Republicans and guerrilla activity. The Continuity IRA has failed to carry out any killings, while the real IRA's only attacks resulting in deaths were the 1998 Omagh bombing, which killed 29 civilians, a booby-trapped torch bomb in Derry which killed a former Ulster Defence Regiment soldier, and a 2009 attack on a Northern Ireland military installation which killed 2 British soldiers and wounded several others. Iran. After 1979 revolution, the Iranian Defense Minister Mustafa Chamran established the Irregular Warfare Headquarters as part of the Iranian Armed Forces. He employed the force against Iraqi military during the Iran-Iraq War. The unit was later disbanded. Many guerrilla tactics were used by the Iraqi insurgency against the US-led coalition. Such tactics include the bombing and ambushing of American and Allied convoys, along with other non-combat moves throughout all US military branches. They went after civilians that worked with the coalition. This included beheadings and public executions. They did hit-and-run raids along with massive attacks on bases. It is reported that 31,994 coalition troops were wounded in action, while 4,418 were killed, 3,481 of whom were killed in action and 937 that were non-hostile. 37% of those hostile combat casualties in Iraq were combat service support or non-combat MOSES, which shows the extent of the guerrilla war waged in Iraq. Sunnis insurgents not only established a de facto government in the Al-Anbar province, they were able to gain huge footholds in Mosul, Telephone Afar, Samarra, northern Baghdad, etc. Insurgent control was maintained despite a series of coalition campaigns. The worsening violence in Baghdad led to the recall of coalition forces, ensuring continued insurgent control. Naxal insurgency. The Naxal insurgency in West Bengal was the beginning of the rising of Maoists in eastern India. The Naxals begun their people's war through radical students in the city of Calcutta. However, it continues today, having its bases in rural India and top universities. The area under Maoist control has been viewed as a war zone, and the group itself has been called the biggest threat to Indian security by the Prime Minister. Afghanistan. The Taliban uprising took place after Afghanistan's invasion by Allied forces in 2001. As in the earlier wars against the British and Soviets, Afghan resistance to the NATO intervention took the traditional form of a Muslim holy war against the infidels. As with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 20 years earlier, the Taliban took refuge in the Pakistani mountain areas and continued to move across the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, often evading Pakistani and NATO forces. The Taliban have now become a dominant role in the Afghan life once again. The Pakistani government have been accused of supporting and/or turning a blind eye to the Afghan Taliban, while the Pakistani government has accused NATO of doing the same.
The French are fighting Muslims of self-determination in Algeria, them and their proxies. The Russians are fighting Islamic self-determination in the Caucasus and in Chechnya. The Indian government is fighting Islamic self-determination in Kashmir. The Chinese government is having a problem with Islamic self-determination in Xinjiang. So all of these, at the end of the day, said, look, we've been fighting them for all of these years. We need the United States to enter into this grand strategy against Islamic self-determination in the world. And the United States was hesitant because it knew what it's going to be involved in if it takes a step in that direction. So what better to drum up support for the United States recruitment for the Israeli Zionist cause than September 11th. And come September 11th, and we have all of this patriotic talk that is sweeping the minds of everyone. For what? To go and kill innocent Muslims in a forsaken land of Afghanistan. What are they going to do in Afghanistan? Bomb it back to the Stone Age? It's already in the Stone Age. What are they going to do? Fight and kill at military fields? There are no military fields, no military air bases, no military ground bases, no military naval bases, no military bases at all in that country. What have they been doing in the past 3 weeks? Dropping bombs on a no man's land. And what are they doing? Killing innocent people in the process. They don't want to face up to that. 1,500 or so have been killed after 3 weeks. Twice they bombed. United States bombers bombed the Red Cross. Not to speak about them bombing civilians, not to speak about them bombing innocent people, not to speak about them dropping bombs in the middle of cities. All of that has occurred. What do they want? They're picking, I don't know if they know it, but in their zeal to satisfy their Zionist Israeli masters now, they're picking a fight with the people who have been hardened by war in the past 20 years. These have been fighting an active war for the past 20 years. These are not people who are living on Snickers and Baby Ruth and the Three Musketeers. These are not going to get diarrhea the second day after they land in Afghanistan. But these American troops, if they're going to place a significant force in Afghanistan, then they'll know what they are up against. This is not to say, as some individuals may take it, that this is an endorsement of the rulers in Kandahar or in Kabul, because these rulers have been in an indirect way sponsored by the United States, because the governments of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that are clients of the United States in the Middle East, these are the only governments who recognize these rulers in Kandahar and in Kabul. But to the general public, no one's going to understand that. No one will ever think that Turgut Özal, the prime minister of Turkey, was killed in a plane crash because of Afghanistan. No one's going to make the connection that Zia al-Haq, who was also the president of Pakistan, was killed in a plane crash. And the American ambassador to Pakistan was on the same plane. They don't kill dirty, they kill dirty. I'm constricted here by time, but let me wind down by an ayah from the Quran. Allah, the source of glory and the source of strength, says, وَإِذَا أَرَدْنَا أَن نُهْلِكَ قَرْيَةً أَمَّرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلُ فَدَمَّرْنَاهَا تَدْمِيرًا. In Surah Al-Isra, that's the 17th chapter of the Quran, there's an ayah which, adapting its meanings into English, means if we want to destroy a social order, we combine the ruling class with the rich class. They become indistinguishable. Amarna mutarafiha. What do they do after that? They cause social disintegration in that social unity, which is what is happening in front of our own eyes here in the United States. And then what happens after that? Then Allah's word taxes them. And what happens after that? They are obliterated. The United States policymakers, decision makers, and strategists have fulfilled the meanings of this ayah if they continue in their course of aggression and warfare against Islamic self-determination in the world, and by the Israeli line and propaganda that we are terrorists. They can't distinguish between self-determination and a terrorist. They are on their way to obliteration. And Allah has spoken the truth. I thank you for your patience. They continue in their course of aggression and warfare against Islamic self-determination in the world, and by the Israeli line and propaganda that we are terrorists. They can't distinguish between self-determination and a terrorist. They are on their way to obliteration. And Allah has spoken the truth. I thank you for your patience with me this evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa la udwana illa ala zalimin.
Come on, you can do better than that. Better than that. Y'all hang in here with us. What better do you have to do than this tonight? Where else can you hear live and uncensored, the pure, unadulterated truth? Hang in here. And please sign the sign-in list so that we may get with you to get you the tape and contact you about further events and movements for the truth. It's been a great evening, and we still got more to go.
Yes, sir.
Get your questions ready. That's all right. We got you. So as soon as we hear from the imam, you have your chance.
Accusation as a student. It goes, if they come for you tonight, most surely they'll come for me in the morning. It says that a good neighbor is one who puts the fire out at his neighbor's house before it gets to his house. America's on fire. It is known as the fall of America. I want to, without further ado, want to introduce to you the national and international chairman of the new Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Bring him on with a hearty round of applause, Malik Zulu Shabazz, Attorney Malik Zulu Shabazz.
Black power. Black power. Black power. Black power. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad abdu rasuluh. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Eugene Allah against the accursed Satan. I bear witness that there is none worthy of worship that Muhammad is the messenger of God. When I bear witness to Muhammad being the messenger of God, I bear witness to Yeshua or Jesus, who was also a worthy servant of the Most High God.
Yes.
I bear witness to Moses, who was also a servant of the Most High God. I bear witness to Abraham, who was also a faithful servant of the Most High God.
Yes, sir.
I bear witness to Akhenaten, the patriarch of monotheism, a worthy servant of the Most High God. I bear witness to all of those who have been sent to us in the line of divine.
Yes.
But sisters and brothers, as a Black man in America, trapped, brought in chains, my ancestors would chop my head off if I didn't come before you tonight and bear witness to Harriet Tubman. So I bear witness to Harriet Tubman. I bear witness to Sojourner Truth. I bear witness to Nat Turner. I bear witness to Frederick Douglass. I bear witness to Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. I bear witness to the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. I bear witness to Noble Drew Ali. I bear witness to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I bear witness to that bold and courageous leader, Minister Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik Shabazz. I bear witness to his students, whose foundation we stand on. And we would not have the privilege to wear this badge, this uniform, Black Panther Party. So I bear witness that if it were not for those like Dr. Huey P. Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Bobby Seale, all of those who went before us and suffered in labor so that we may struggle on in the name of the Black Panther Party. So I bear witness to the original founders of the Black Panther Party. I bear witness to that man, that international revolutionary who worked to unite the oppressed, who has gone on to the ancestors, but his spirit lives on. You knew him in the 1960s as that radical firebrand, Stokely Carmichael, Black Power. He gave us the theme and the ring, Black Power. He went on to be called the name Kwame Ture. But I bear witness to Kwame Ture. I bear witness to Dr. John Henry Clark. We in the new Black Panther Party working on behalf of an international revolution. We bear witness not just to those who were sent to us, but we bear witness to those who have struggled against injustice and tyranny all over the 196,940,000 square miles of the planet. So I bear witness to Ho Chi Minh. I bear witness to Mao Zedong. I bear witness to Kim Il-sung. I bear witness to the Honorable Ayatollah Khomeini. I bear witness to Gamal Nasser. I bear witness to Che Guevara. I bear witness to Fidel Castro. I know these names are going to get me in trouble. But if I live to be 1,000, or the ripe old age of Methuselah, sisters and brothers here tonight, I could never thank God enough for our leader in the new Black Panther Party, who has gone on to the ancestors, but his spirit lives on. I speak of none other than our spiritual and revolutionary leader, a freedom fighter, who fought hard against Zionism, who fought hard and strong against racism, who was uncompromising and could not be found capitulating to the enemy on any day of the week. I speak of none other than this bold and fearless and courageous Black man, this international revolutionary whose foundation we stand on, whose legacy we are proud to carry on. So I speak and bear witness none other than to Minister and Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad. Black Power. Allahu Akbar. Akbar. To all of the brothers and sisters who are here tonight at the National Press Club, where it is supposed to be a free exchange of ideas under the First Amendment of the Constitution. Well, you know, we're going to test that tonight. We're going to test that tonight. To the National Assistant of the new Black Panther Party, that courageous brother fighting on behalf of our people right here in Washington, D.C., laboring and struggling with a courageous spirit. Man who I love very much, Brother Amir Muhammad. Let's give him a round of applause. To all of the brothers, my family, my friends, my allies, my comrades, here and all across our 30 chapters throughout America and our chapters throughout the world, in Germany and in Africa, on behalf of the new Black Panther Party for self-defense. We're happy to welcome you out here tonight. Happy to be here with a longtime struggler in the community. He's the CEO of Ceasefire, Don't Smoke the Brothers, an uncompromising activist in our community. He's in a wheelchair, but he does the work of 100 men from in a wheelchair. I speak of one of my mentors and one of my allies, Brother Malik Farrakhan. Malik Farrakhan from Ceasefire, Don't Smoke the Brothers. To Dr. Marilyn Preston Killingham from the Republic of New Africa, an international human rights activist fighting strong on behalf of our people. Give her another round of applause. My dear beloved brother, Imam Akbar Bilal, who always is giving up strong light, strong truth. Let's give him a round of applause. The Imam of Masjid al-Islam in Washington, D.C., one of the strongest imams in the city, I'm dare to say anywhere in the country, an uncompromising imam. You know, they got Uncle Tom imams these days. Yeah, they do. But he's not an Uncle Tom Imam. He is fearless in fighting in the way of God, fearless in fighting against the forces of tyranny. Imam Abdul Alim Musa. Let's give him a strong round of applause. Akbar. To our beloved brothers from our international family who are here with us, and you will hear from them in a few moments. Don't worry, we got all night. And there's a lot of truth to be revealed tonight. But to Imam Abdel Razak of the Ivy City Masjid here in Washington, D.C., from Jordan. But he's right here in Washington, D.C., and he's not afraid to come out and stand with us tonight. So let's give him a round of applause. Give him a round of applause. We thank Allah for him. From the Islamic Center, we call him the real Imam from the Islamic Center. You know, the government is taking over some of these masjids. I'll get back to that in a moment. Imam Mohammed Asi from Syria. Let's give him a round of applause. He has his roots in the Republic of Iran. So I want to tell you tonight, family, I'm so elated. Because when you see the black man and the black woman, the Africans and the descendants of Africa standing side by side with our Arab brothers and sisters, and when you see all of us, Muslims, some non-Muslims, but all of us committed to the liberation struggle, what you are witnessing here tonight is a united front of the oppressed. A united front of the oppressed. And we are pledging here tonight that we are going to hook up, that we are going to link up, that we are going to fear no God but God. And we are going to stand and challenge the forces of imperialism. We are going to challenge the forces of Zionism. We are going to challenge the forces of racism. We are going to challenge the forces of America, Israel, Britain. We are going to stand against their tyranny. And we bear witness that we will fear God and God alone. For God alone is who we should fear. When we talk, sisters and brothers, and we come out tonight, September 11th, we're not only talking to this audience, but by the grace of God, we're talking to the whole world tonight. It's being carried around the whole world. And the world needs to know that everybody in America is not carrying the same line in America. People around the world need to know that all of us are not lining up with Mr. Bush in this hour. We have to tell Mr. Bush in this hour. We have to tell Mr. Colin Powell in this hour. We have to tell Rumsfeld in this hour. We have to tell Ashcroft in this hour. We have to tell them like Daniel told the wicked rulers in Babylon, Beelzebub and Nebuchadnezzar. He told him in the book of Daniel, he said, Mene, tekel, upharsin. He said, thy kingdom has been numbered. Thy kingdom has been weighed in the balance and found wanted and shall soon be divided. When you see the World Trade Center, 110 stories high, said by the builders and the architects that it would last 1,000, 2,000 years. And when you see the Twin Towers up one day, come crashing and tumbling down, you want to know what the hell is going on in America. When you hear of men who will take box cutters or knives or will sacrifice their lives and get in their airplanes and drive airplanes in the buildings and send them buildings tumbling down, you want to know what the hell is going on in America. When you see the Pentagon, the awesome, mighty Pentagon, seemingly impenetrable, seemingly untouchable. When you see the Pentagon struck and when you see America shook up, all of you want to know what the hell is going on in America. When you hear about anthrax, when you hear anthrax shutting down the Congress, shutting down the federal institution, shutting down the Supreme Court, shutting down the White House, you want to know what the hell is going on in America. Somebody throw soap powder in the hallway, the whole building shut down. You want to know what the hell is going on in America and blaming it on Osama bin Laden is not going to cut it. Huh? Bombing. Bombing the innocent people in Afghanistan is not going to solve the problem for America. Bombing innocent people, bombing Muslims, waging a war against Islam. And let us be unequivocal and clear. We see this as a continuing pattern of America, Britain, and Israel's war against Islam and the oppressed people of the earth. Bombing Afghanistan will not solve the problem, Mr. Bush. Bombing Somalia will not solve your problem, Mr. Bush. Bombing the peoples of the earth, Arab, non-Arab, African, will not solve your problem, Mr. Bush, but we're going to try to help you tonight to solve your problem. But whether or not America solves our problem, we must get together tonight to understand how we will survive what that little black man from Sandersville, Georgia, Elijah Muhammad, called the fall of America. When you see blaming it on bin Laden is not the problem. Blaming it on bin Laden. World Trade Center blow up. Blame it on bin Laden. Huh? Pentagon attacked. Blame it on bin Laden. Bush. Slip on some soap in the shower. Blame it on bin Laden. Mr. Bush, wife won't sleep with him at night. Blame it on bin Laden. Supreme Court shut down. Blame it on bin Laden. I think that people deserve a better answer than that. There's no one man on the earth that could be this powerful. And while they are blaming it on bin Laden, we are unequivocal to say we don't blame it on bin Laden. We blame it on George Bush. We blame it on Bush. Turn this mic up. Whoever got the mic, they need to turn the microphone up. We blame it on Bush. Since Bush got into office, the whole world is going awry. I blame it on Bush. Since Bush got into office, no one can sleep at night. I blame it on Bush. Since Bush got into office, everything is going crazy. We don't blame it on bin Laden. We blame it on George Bush, the executioner from Texas. Well, I ask a lot of guidance tonight, but there's no spirit of compromise in the new Black Panther Party. There's no spirit of compromise or weakness in the students of Khalid Abdul Muhammad. We say like we say in our prayers, why Be alone. Talking about Allah. One God. Be alone do we serve. Thine aid do we beseech for help. We don't blame it on bin Laden. We blame it on Bush. But not only do we blame it on Bush, we blame it on his predecessor, Bill Clinton, who bombed Sudan, who bombed innocent Africans in Sudan, bombed and killed innocent people in Sudan, and waged a continuous bombing campaign against the innocent Iraqi people and starved the Iraqi people in Iraq. We blame it on Bush, but we blame it on Bill Clinton as well. Not only do we blame it on Bill Clinton, we blame it on Bush Sr., who was a dope dealer. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. We blame it on Bush Sr. We blame it on the man who came before him, old warmonger Ronald Wilson Reagan. We blame it on Jimmy Carter. We blame it on Gerald Ford. We blame it on Richard Tricky Dick Nixon. We blame it on Imam Jamil Al-Amin, H. Rap Brown, call him the camel breath hunky from Texas. We blame it on Lyndon Baines Johnson. We blame it on John the Fox Kennedy. We blame it on Eisenhower. We blame it on Harriet Truman. Oh, we didn't come to blame the victim tonight. We didn't come to blame the victims of imperialism and Zionism and racism. We come to call the terrorists who the terrorist really is. And we say to you straight up that the number one terrorist on the face of the planet Earth, the number 1 and 2 terrorists right now on the planet Earth are the United States of America and Israel. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Repeat it, I say it with no apologies to the world, the number 1 and 2 terrorists with terrorist Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles, battleships, F-16 airplanes are the United States or the United Snakes and Israel. You want to know about terrorism? Please, in all due respect, my beloved family, come and talk to the black man and woman of America. You want to know about terrorism? Bring it out. Yes, sir. Bring it out. You want to know about terrorism? Talk to the children of slaves here in the hells of North America. For we have been terrorized by America. Bring me that flag over here, brother. Bring that flag over here. We have been terrorized by America. No, hold it up. Hold that up.
Yes, sir.
And give me a good lecture.
Yes, sir.
Bear with me. Bear with me. Hold that one, brother. You want to talk about terrorism? Well, I want you to understand, to my brothers and sisters from across the world, our Arab brothers and sisters, you want to know why we say black power and why we're into blackness. It is because we have been the victims of terrorism for over 400 years that has terrorized us out of our blackness, stripped us of our culture, stripped us of our religion, stripped us of our name and our God. And when we say black power, dear Imam, we're trying to get back that which was lost when we were brought to America. Some of us were Muslims. Some of us were Hebrews. Some of us were indigenous African religions. But we were terrorized out of our God, terrorized out of our religion. And our mission in the new Black Panther Party is to resurrect and redeem that which has been destroyed by the true terrorists. And our broader mission is to hook up and link up with all of the oppressed people on the earth. But if you want to talk about terrorism, pardon me, we handle it hard here. But when you want to talk about terrorism, we want to talk about a slave trade. We want to talk about a slave trade where 150 million African lives were lost in the slave trade by America and the European powers. And our blood, our bones, our bodies today are at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, terrorized by the Americans who brought us in to this country to be burden bearers for them, terrorized. If you want to talk about terrorism, talk to us about Rosewood. Talk to us about a town in Florida, a black town where every single black man and woman was wiped out of the entire town. Talk to us about the terrorism of black men being hung and lynched from trees right here in America. Talk to us about black women being raped over and over and over again right here in America. Talk to us about police brutality and being terrorized by being shot in the back, shot down like dogs over and over and over again. I want you to understand why we have to deal with race, beloved Muslim family in America, because we have been terrorized. Yes, sir, by the true racists. We want to talk about terrorism. Let's talk about Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, where in the early 1900s, we had a growing black economic empire. But American terrorists, white people in America, bombed and destroyed Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. I'm talking about terrorism now. We want a war on terrorism. The war on terrorism should have started 400 years ago. Bring the flag, brother. Hold that. Continue to hold that up. Bring the flag. Because I'm here to tell you that false patriotism will not get you out of this. Holding a bandana get you out of this. You might be saying, God bless America. But when did America ever bless God? You might be saying, God bless America. But God might be damning America at this very hour. No one is sleeping in America. Bush is not sleeping in America. Rumsfeld cannot sleep in America. The stock market is crashing in America. America don't look like she look too good right about now. Maybe she needs to seek another path, but it looks doubtful that she will. To us, our family, I'm talking about to our brothers and sisters in America, this flag is represented, the red in the flag represents the blood of the black man and woman that drips in the soil of America. The blue represents the waters of the Atlantic Ocean that our ancestors were carried across. And the 50 stars to us only represent 50 different kinds of justice. Not one star like the star in the flag of Islam, but 50 stars, 50 different kinds of justice. This flag to us has represented terrorism. Well, Mr. Shabazz, why don't you go back to Africa? Let me tell you this. With the permission of the red man, the so-called Indian, with the permission of the red man, the so-called Indian, I have a right to say what I say. I have a right to feel how we feel because our mothers and fathers built this land. Our mothers and fathers built this country. Our mothers and fathers labored and died here, and I do not have to co-sign onto your wicked agenda as we were brought here by force. I have a right to dissent. We have a right to dissent. So whoever's in charge of turn this mic up some. We have a right to dissent. When did America ever bless God? When did America ever really try to do right about the indigenous peoples of the planet Earth? Let's talk about the red man, the Indian, who was terrorized all the way out of existence in the form of genocide. Move this back, please. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. Oh, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. This is great tonight. This is what Malcolm El-Hajj Malik Shabazz was working on. He was working on creating a united front of the oppressed where Muslims and other oppressed people would get together and support each other and love each other and care for each other and look out for you. And to our Arab brothers and sisters, despite whatever disagreements we have had, we, the new Black Panther Party, have put on this form, not only for us, but out of love for you. Because we don't like what they're doing to you in America. We don't like what they're doing to you around the world. So we stand up for you, not only on our behalf, but on your behalf as well. Let's talk about the Red Indian terrorized 90% of the population of the Red Indian, driven out of America by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, slave owners, slave traders, Indian killers. Oh yeah, the world needs to know George Washington was a terrorist. Thomas Jefferson was a terrorist. If Osama bin Laden is a terrorist, he got to be the terrorist that terrorism produced. If Osama bin Laden is a hater, he must be the hater that hatred produced. Let's talk now. Let's take a look at American foreign policy. Don't worry, we got plenty of time. Let's take a look at American foreign policy. And we have to say that September 11th, in our firm opinion, was America reaping the results of her worldwide crimes. But we take it a step further. Not only is America reaping the results of her worldwide crimes, but she's reaping her results. She's reaping her results. I'll get to that. But they're reaping their results of their historical crimes against the very people of God who are brought here to America. So it's a double-pronged sword. And not only for her crimes across the earth, I'm going to get to them. I ain't just talking rhetoric, but for her crimes against our people. We are unabashed in saying at this point in time that what happened on September 11th, like Malcolm said, was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. It could have been foreseen a long time ago. It could have been foreseen a long time ago. This foreign policy, which is rooted in America's support for Zionism. Most and almost every leader we've heard has been afraid to take up and deal with Zionism head on. But we say it to the world, and we hope this message reaches right over there to so-called Israel. The head of Israel, Ariel Sharon, he is a madman. He is a murderer. He is a terrorist. I said Sharon is a terrorist. And the state of Israel has terrorized the Palestinians and the people of that land ever since 1948. Terrorist state was set up called Israel. It's really Palestine. It's the so-called state of Israel. Set up terrorizing the Palestinians since 1948. We have never wept. Talking about you in the American public, you have never wept a tear for the Palestinians. Palestinians, babies, men, women, children dying in Palestine, shot down with the help of America. America and Israel, inseparable in the Zionist partnership. Gunning down, killing the Palestinians. Oh, it's just another day. Oh, just 500 Palestinians killed. Oh, Israel steal some more land. Israel takes some more land. The state of Israel is a colonial state. State of Israel is an imperialist state. And we agree with the United Nations resolution that was passed in the 80s. And that was reaffirmed again in Durban, South Africa, that Zionism is racism. Zionism is racism. Zionism is imperialism. Zionism is colonialism. And Zionism and support for Zionism, support for Israel is the root of why so many were killed on September 11th. And to all people in America, regardless to who you are, you must understand that the government of America has lied to the American public. Yes, right. The government of America has lied to you. And by lying to you, they have put your lives at risk. They have committed acts of murder based on money and oil and other wicked interests, and have lied to the public and thereby put the average American citizen at risk. So going along and waving the flag and going along with what the government is saying is not necessarily in your best interest. Even if you don't like what we're saying, America, you need to take a clear listen to what we're saying, because what we're saying tonight may help you to save your life. You need to take a different message to Mr. Bush. The support for Zionism, the support for Israel, the support for the persecution and the destruction of the Palestinians must end. If there's to be peace on the earth, no true Jew can be a Zionist. I'm going to say that again. No true Jew, no true believer in the Torah can be a Zionist, because Zionism is against the very principles of Almighty God as revealed through his prophets. Now, let's go on to Iraq. But before we go to Iraq, we got to make a point. The reason why everyone's so afraid of saying this, and we have to make it plain that the Zionists control America, lock, stock, and barrel. Oh yeah, the Zionists control America. The European Jews have America under their control, lock, stock, and barrel. The media, foreign policy. Let me go to Iraq as I bring this to a conclusion. 1.5 million Iraqis killed over the last decade. Who weeps for them? Who weeps for us? You can put them down, man. Who weeps for them? Let's give them a round of applause. Who weeps for them? Iraqi babies, 500,000 dead, starved by a policy that was not based on any rational foreign policy by America, but the foreign policy was based on oil and based on dominating oil interests in the Persian Gulf. It is correct. Saddam Hussein lined up with America against his brothers and sisters in Iran, and he was wrong for that. And he was sucker punched. Yes, he was. He was sucker punched in the Gulf War. He made his mistake. He lost the Gulf War. He paid for his mistake, even though Kuwait is originally part of Iraq. Even though. But what has gone on in the last 10 years is completely unjustified by any sane, ethical thinking human being. Here you take a man's country and you tell him you cannot fly planes in your own country for 10 years. Huh? You tell the man you cannot fly planes in your own country and you rain bombs on his people for 10 years and you expect the peoples of the earth to lay back and ignore that? We say to America in all humility, do not expect everyone else on the earth to take their oppression the way the black man and woman in America have taken their oppression. Do not expect everyone across the earth to lay down and beg and plead for justice when you shoot them in the back and bomb them the way some of us in America have done. For the very Bible says, as thou hast done, so shall it be done unto you. And as you have taken our blood, this is the Bible talk. You shall be given your own blood to drink like water, starving the Iraqis, and continuing this lie about weapons of mass destruction when the largest storage of anthrax, the largest storage of chemical and biological weapons rests with the United States and Israel. Foreign policy, Saudi Arabia, the Caspian Sea, seeking the oil in the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, amassing American troops in Saudi Arabia. Have you ever considered how the Muslims feel about that? Have you ever taken into account, Mr. Bush, how the Muslims feel about that? Bombing Afghanistan is not going to get you out of that. Bombing the Muslims is only producing more Muslims who have an intense hatred, not just to hate America for the sake of hating America, but they hate the injustice and the tyranny that is being poured on them by America and Israel. We are advising all our brothers and sisters not to line up with this war and don't sacrifice your black bodies. Do not sacrifice your bodies, whoever you are, going over there dying in Afghanistan. And it is very clear that they in for a long haul in Afghanistan. You can send all the cruise missiles you want to. You can send all the Tomahawk missiles you want to. You can send all the little satellite imagery photos. You see, it was here. This was the bunker. And you see, after that, it's gone. That's not working. That's not working in Afghanistan. It looked to me like the Taliban are holding on. And I don't remember the Taliban calling me a nigger anytime recently. Huh? Oh, we got to tell the truth here tonight. Don't line up with this war. Don't sacrifice your body going over there to fight a war that is for oil and for control over another people's land and country. If you want to take a stand today, take a stand for world peace. Take a stand for the end of economic tyranny, economic imperialism. Take a stand against this new global economic order that is seeking to permanently impoverish the black and the brown in favor of a white European hegemony. That's what we should take a stand for. In my conclusion, we're in a time of prophecy. Yes, sir. All imams, and we invite the imams, the learned imams, the ulama in the audience. Don't be afraid to take a look in this Bible. Right. The Quran says to believe in that which was revealed unto thee. And the Quran being the final revelation or the criteria. But this Bible is full of prophecies that relate to America. And despite your disagreements, don't discard the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because he made a lot of prophetic calculations that are precisely on time for this day and time. And whether you know it or not, In Revelations, I'm going to close with this, but everybody needs to hear this. Mr. Bush needs to hear this. The Christian scholars need to hear this. Revelations 18th chapter says, and I saw these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hold of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I heard another voice come from heaven saying, come out of her. Says, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. When you see anthrax sweeping America, you're looking at a plague in America. And the book of Exodus talks about the 5th plague in Exodus, where all of the cattle died in Egypt. And then there was a 6th plague when all of the people died from touching the cattle. And our interpretation today is that the cattle is the male in America. And even though the male is intended for Dashiell, even though the male is intended for Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Mr. Bush, it's Daniel and Shadrach and the children of slaves that got to handle the male. And so it's killing us as it is sent to and to kill those who it is sent for. So we've been warned to come out of her. We've been warned, Brother Malik, to come out of her, but we have refused to come out of her. Now the plagues are coming down on America, and we're being caught with the plagues coming down on America. The Revelations 18:6 say, reward her, even as she has rewarded you, and double unto her. I'm scared of that. Double unto her, according to her works, in the cup which she hath filled to her double. How much has she glorified in herself? How much has she glorified in herself? We are the greatest, most powerful country that has ever existed. When did you ever preface that? By saying, inshallah. When did we ever preface that by giving glory to God? No, you got your chest stuck out. Revelations 18:7 say, how much has she glorified in herself and lived deliciously? So much torment and sorrow give her, for she hath saith in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. She could say that yesterday. I said a queen, am no widow, shall see no sorrow. She didn't care. No one had sympathy for the Japanese when 250,000 Japanese were vaporized. All of them innocent civilians, all so what? But today, it has come to America. Therefore her plagues shall come. It says, Revelations 18:8. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, and death, mourning, and famine shall she be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. They say they shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. That's September 11th all the way. Standing off afar for the fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment. According to the scriptures, and we can't back away from it. We are living in a modern Babylon, but that Babylon was brought down by Almighty God. It did not last forever. We're living in a modern Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah is mighty, but the Almighty Lord God brought her down with fire and brimstone. You talk about, as gives it in the Bible, ancient Egypt, powerful and mighty, but Almighty God brought her down through her servant Moses and through chastisement for the sins she had committed. You talk about ancient Rome, and they said the Roman Empire would never end, but ancient Rome was brought to an end. They said the sun would never set on the British Empire, that it stretched all across the earth, but the sun set on the British Empire. Well, that day has come. Submission to the will of God. And that is the only way today. We all have to get right. We got to get right. If there's any hope for America, she has to get right. But we say in conclusion, we have to survive the fall of America. The Quran say, oh, you who believe, keep your duty to your Lord. Oh, you who believe, keep your duty to your Lord. If Mr. Bush is your Lord, keep your duty to him. If Almighty God Allah is your Lord, keep your duty to him. Thank you very much. We want you to hold fast. We got very special guests that's going to give us another perspective